When Governor Patrick came out with his new budget plan last month, he found a good deal of support for initiatives in learning, transportation, and healthcare. There were still calls for some budget increases, but also concerns about his call for new revenues, especially for increasing the state income tax. Among those looking over the figures is our guest, the Executive Director of the Mass Budget and Policy Center, Noah Berger. Thank you very much for being with us again, Noah.
Great to be here.
If you consider the time we're in right now, the economic recovery still looks dicey as it has for quite a while. You have all these concerns about the state having enough money, and is this really the right time for the governor to be thinking big?
I think that's a very important question. And I think the answer is we need to look both at the short term and at the long term. First, when you think about the short term, a state is required to balance its budget. So in order to be able to do things, you need revenue. And in thinking about the economic effects, you have to look at both sides of that. So for example, if you have an income tax increase and somebody who's, let's say, makes at the high end $1 million a year, their taxes could go up by 1%. Yes, that will have some effect probably on the economy. It's hard to say exactly how much because it depends upon whether they reduce their savings or their spending and whether they would have been spending in the state or on things they purchased from out of state. But on the other side of that is if you have, 10 of those people have $1 million, have their taxes go up a little bit, the state then takes that revenue and, for example, hires a construction worker to build a road or repair potholes, and that money goes right back into the economy. In that case, the state's directly, with that revenue, directly creating a job, and that person who gets the job then can begin spending money in the local economy. So when economists look at this in the short term, particularly during a recession, the positive effects of being able to directly put people to work doing important things outweigh the negative effects and overall have a modest positive effect on the economy.
Well, talk about what happens here. Let's say the average family pays a higher income tax and maybe some of these other taxes that are being put on the table, but at the same time, maybe the housing market recovers a bit. How do you see that working out?
Yeah, I think it's important to look at all of those factors together and ask the question, what can the state do to strengthen our economy, to make it so that more families have, more working people have good jobs that pay enough to support their family. And when you look at the things that a state can do that really have an effect in the long run on the economy, one is good transportation infrastructure so that people can get to work without the T breaking down. Businesses can move their products around the state and get their workers to work. But equally important is education. And if you look across the country, there's one factor that determines whether states have a high-wage economy or not, and that's how well-educated their workforce is. More and more, companies are locating their jobs that pay good wages where they can find highly educated workers. And states have a huge role to play in that. The basic state function is education. And it's not just education. If you think about half of our workforce now has a college degree, which leads the country. It's a good news story. It's why we have a relatively high-wage economy. But it means about half of our workforce doesn't. And if you think about what it would take to strengthen our economy, to make sure that more people have those higher levels of skills, that more education that can bring in higher paying jobs, it's helping those kids. And that's partly making college more affordable. And the governor, I think, smartly puts a lot of resources into that. But it's also, starting when they're very young, early education to make sure that kids begin school ready to learn. There's a lot of evidence that that's an important part of what allows those kids to be successful all along. But also, it's not just education, it's other things, making sure that kids are healthy and have adequate nutrition and that they have safe neighborhoods to live in. So a lot of the things that we think of as things that we do to help kids, and sometimes low-income kids, sometimes middle-income kids, are important for those kids and their families, but they're also really, in many ways, the most important things in the long term that we can do to build a stronger economy.
Well, talk about how these things can ripple in their effects here, too, because the governor wants to increase access to preschool, and there's a waiting list for many low-income families. Then I look at the most abysmal reading scores in Boston, at least the most abysmal schools for that, high concentrations of low-income kids. So I guess the governor, maybe he's onto something here.
Yeah, you're right, that we have much too high. There's a lot of evidence that whether kids can read by the time they're in third grade is going to have a lot to do with how successful they are throughout the rest of their lives. And the good news is Massachusetts actually leads the country in kids reading by third grade. The bad news is that a whole lot of our kids can't, and particularly in a lot of our cities, we're not meeting that threshold, and that holds them back for the rest of their lives. So to address that, you both have to look at what happens between kindergarten and third grade. But increasingly, there's evidence you have to look at what happens before kindergarten, when kids are 3 and 4 years old. If they have access to good, high-quality early education, it makes a big difference in being able to meet those later benchmarks. Another thing for early education is, besides the really important educational component of it, low-income working parents, and even middle-income working parents, often need childcare. So if you're a low-income mother trying to go into the workforce to support your family, and you have a 3 or 4-year-old, you can't work unless you have care for the child. So good early care and education can both provide that care for kids to allow their parents to work, and that strengthens our economy overall. But then it also, if it's high quality, can really help those kids to be ready for school.
Lots of agreement out there in transportation when it comes to replacing disabled trains and disabled trolleys, but the governor's also talking about growth. Is it really premature, maybe?
Well, it's a good and important question. In the governor's plan, I think it's roughly about 80% of the money is going into rehabilitating and maintaining existing infrastructure that we have, which I think is important to make sure that the T doesn't break down, that it continues to function, that our roads across the state aren't marked with potholes. Obviously, if you have potholes in your roads, lots of cars drive over them and blow an axle. That's a lot more expensive than fixing it up front. New projects, I think it's a case-by-case basis of whether they make sense. And a major one is extending the Green Line into Somerville. That's a very highly populated area. It could unleash significant private sector development. Similarly,
Fairmount Corridor here in Boston.
Yep, Fairmount Corridor, exactly. So I think it's a question for those proposals. Are you doing enough to generate economic development by moving forward with those proposals, and is it good development that helps those local communities that really need help? And if so, I think it's a good investment, but those are judgments you really have to make.
The other thing here is about the way the new revenue proposals fall along that spread from the bottom to the top here. And, you know, the governor clearly is not talking about 1% coming up for the 99% here. We're talking about middle to middle more than anything else.
Yeah, one of the issues with our tax system now is that it's what we call regressive. Highest income people in the state pay less of their income in taxes than low and middle income people. And one of the things the governor's proposal does is to try to level that out some, so that higher income people would be paying a slightly larger share of the new revenue than low and middle income people. And the way he does that is to shift our tax system a little bit from reliance on the sales tax to more reliance on the income tax. The sales tax is our tax that hits low and middle income people the hardest, or that they pay the most in, because high income people tend to invest or save a significant share of their income, so they don't pay sales taxes on that. Lower and middle income people spend a much larger share of their income, so they end up paying a larger share of their income in sales taxes. So by reducing the sales tax, that gives larger tax reductions to low and middle income people, and then raising the income tax is a more equitable tax that high income people pay as well.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Great to be here.
From the Mass Budget and Policy Center, Noah Berger.